Sustainability. I hear this word all the time in Portland. I hear this word in different communities. We have fallout from Fukushima coming down, and we don't know much about it, and yet we use this word sustainability. And I ask myself, and I'm just posing this question to all of you, what is sustainable when you have nuclear fallout? For me, there's not a whole lot that is sustainable. What are we sustaining? We're really getting radiated. And we need to know what to do, and we need to know how to cope with this. And we need to know before all of that what exactly is happening to us from Fukushima, from Hanford, from the Columbia Generating Station, and from nukes in general across the US and across the seas.
In a day and age of ecocide, one agent of environmental destruction is nuclear power. On March 11th, 2011, an 8.9 earthquake occurred off the coast of Japan. It caused a 46-foot-tall tsunami that hit the Fukushima nuclear complex. 2 years, 8 months, 29 days later, the Fukushima nuclear accident is still ongoing. It is now estimated, and this is the latest estimate, that 300 tons, 80,000 gallons of radioactive cesium and strontium contaminated water is leaking into the Pacific daily. The total radiation from Fukushima exceeds that of the 1986 Chernobyl catastrophe.
I'm not a scientist. If I had to boil it down, I would say I'm an artist. And what does an artist do? An artist perceives reality and then articulates it in some form or shape. And that's what I've been trying to do all my life. I would call myself a media activist. When the explosions happened in Fukushima, I knew right away what we were up against. And I also knew that we were not going to get the real story. But I didn't know what to do with it. It was huge. It's existential. They lied all through 2011. They did nothing in 2012. And the situation just got worse. So this year, we set our sights on breaking the media sound barrier. We brought Yastel Yamada and Chieko Shina to Sonoma County. We introduced them to people. We did a workshop on denial. We had a psychiatrist come and help people work through the denial. How can you embrace this, the immensity of this? Now, Fukushima is here. Literally, in a way, it's not that bad yet, but it's here in the sense if you saw a picture of the galaxy, you could put an arrow and point to this little dot that is called Earth. And Fukushima is here, and it's not going away.
By way of background, right in our backyard, up in the Tri-Cities, we have the most contaminated site radiologically in North America. There's liquid nuclear waste in tanks that are leaking. There's nuclear waste in soil that's percolating towards groundwater. There are almost 75 square miles of groundwater that are contaminated with chemical and nuclear waste above standards that are suitable for drinking. And then there is nuclear waste that's actively percolating into the Columbia River. And they, for decades, produced plutonium to make nuclear weapons. You know, in some ways, cleanup of Hanford and I'm sure of Fukushima, it's a euphemism. We're talking about protecting the public and putting this stuff in a place where it's not going to get into fish habitat for as long as we can, because uranium has even a longer half-life than plutonium. And now we're looking at the specter of leaking nuclear waste tanks, percolating the most toxic radioactive waste in the world into the groundwater that moves to the Columbia River. And it may take decades, but there are 56 million gallons of extremely high-level radioactive waste at Hanford that are essentially in tanks that are not suited to hold them.
Got back involved in the nuclear power issue after Fukushima. I had been involved. I actually was on the board of Columbia Riverkeeper, and we'd been concerned about Hanford issues, but in a sense we'd forgotten about one of the dangers that's on the Columbia River, which is this nuclear power plant, this formerly known as Whoops 2. In the 90s, they changed its name to the Columbia Generating Station. They were still being called Whoops up until 1998, but they decided that Energy Northwest was more dignified. And one of the reasons we got concerned about this reactor was its similarity to the ones that melted down in Japan. It's a GE boiling water reactor of similar vintage to the ones that melted down. It's a slightly newer version, but it still has the same basic flaw of a very small and narrow containment vessel that can be easily overwhelmed in an accident. The other thing that Lloyd alluded to that's concerning about this design is the spent fuel pool. If you had somehow lost the water from the bottom of that pool, you could have an overheating, and then we would have a new largest nuclear power accident ever in history.
Alternative energy. It seems like we should be talking about that.
Denmark for many years has been promoting wind energy, and I think they're 80% renewable right now in terms of their electricity. And Portugal's pretty close behind. There's a lot of renewables in Spain. But Germany is the most dramatic because Germany is a country that's very heavily industrial and uses a lot of power.
The reason that Germany is doing so well with solar right now is because after Fukushima happened, 6 months later, the people of Germany went out into the streets. They all went out in the tens of thousands and marched through Germany saying, and including Angela Merkel, saying, okay, we're going to shut this down. And they created a plan on the spot to shut down every single nuke power plant in Germany according to a time frame that actually made sense. So that's people power.
I also remember the DOE, Oregon's DOE, talking about being able to find nuclear radiation waste within the plants.
Crops in the immediate vicinity of Hanford aren't the main risk. I think in terms of the river, it's important to recognize that there is absolutely nuclear waste getting into the river from Hanford today. DOE does not dispute this. They find it in fish tissue. They find it in plants next to the river. So much so that the idea of planting vegetation along the river to take up that nuclear waste is a controversial part of the cleanup strategy, where people are worried that you're just concentrating it into plant tissues and bringing it up out of the soil towards the air where it can be more readily released.
If there's contamination released from Columbia Generating Station, that affects Hanford and its cleanup. If there's an accident at Hanford, that affects the operation of the Columbia Generating Station. We got a major book of matches sitting upriver that we got to try and stop from catching fire.
When we look at where this disaster has happened, when we look at the geological area where they put these reactors in Japan right on the Ring of Fire, and we look at where the Hanford site is geologically, and we're learning more about that, I understand. But when we look around the world at where these other nuclear power plants are, do you see any trends where it almost looks like it was intentionally placed, like these plants were placed in an area of the Earth where this type of disaster was going to happen inevitably, eventually?
One thing to remember is that nuclear power plants that have fuel pools need cooling water. And so they're all situated on the water. If we go over to the Great Lakes, just look on a map, you'll see, man, far too many nuclear power plants sitting on those lakes. And if you do a little bit of research on any of those power plants, you will see that there has been waste leaked into the drinking supply out, in Michigan. I think that was the latest one. And by the gallons. And this stuff doesn't make the mainstream press.
The approach that says that we have these ungodly amounts of radioactive waste that we don't quite know what to do with, but we've got all this room in these spent fuel pools, and before they get full, we'll figure it out. It's not really working out very well for us. It may not, it might not be anything as far out as the aliens, or it just might be greed that's gotten us here. And I think that the disease of greed is something that we all need to recognize as being the root cause of many of our problems.
Any kind of credibility we can marshal on this issue is trumped by a mother. This is where the life of what we are here on this planet for becomes an urgent question that we have to defend. How do we defend it? We have to think differently. We have to honor different values, and we need to put those people in their place if we can. But I'm a little more pessimistic than the people here. I'm looking for a spiritual transformation.
Most of the stuff that I've heard goes far beyond politics and has to do with evacuating the West Coast.
And it's an impossibility. I mean, they should have evacuated Tokyo, and their solution was to raise the level of what they call safe. Right. That's how they got around it. It's a very easy trick. But there is no place to run to. It's a question of time. If you move to the southern hemisphere, which is safer than the northern hemisphere for aerosol distribution, yes, you might get another decade. But the Earth is a closed system, and you need to understand that we have a faucet spewing radioactivity that's going to be spewing 1,000 years, and nobody knows how to turn it off. So I don't think evacuation is a possibility.
You know, I think Malcolm's absolutely right, and you're right. We have a spiritual void in this world, but especially in this country. We're right in the center of it. We need to really be looking totally differently at how we organize our society in terms of the things that we do to the whole concept of growth and how we, you know, this season that we're in right now of consumerism only feeds into this need for more electricity. We need to be more intelligent in what we're doing, just across the board, and we need to be talking to everybody about it.
So I also, along with the spiritual void, feel like there's a legal void that's missing, and you know, in law, truth is the most powerful and effective form of making actions happen. There's a lot of petitions going on. There's a lot of marches going on. A lot of statements are being made, but it's, to me, in my understanding, not actual legal process of holding these people accountable.
Like, we really need to be trying everything, and if somebody has good legal abilities and the capacity to file good lawsuits, they should try that as well, I think.
I have two words to say to that, and it's Price Anderson. And Price Anderson is a very real blocker. I would say something else, but it's nasty. It is a blocker of this kind of thing. And no matter what you want to do, and what we should be doing by holding people accountable for what they are doing, there is no accountability because our government created a way for there to be exactly that, no accountability. It's the same as the oil people, it's the same as all of that.
I think we also have to consider the enemy. And, you know, the enemy is a combination of things. If you look at the history of nuclear power, the reason why we have nuclear power plants is because after World War II, there were a group of people that wanted to beat the sword into a plowshare. They wanted to find some way to peacefully use the atom, to take it away from the perspective of nuclear weapons. And so that brought up this idea of using nuclear power plants to generate electricity. The only thing is the utilities were not willing to involve themselves in it because they saw the liability right up front. And so what happened was they went to Congress and they got the Price-Anderson Act passed, and the deal with the devil was for the government to take over the liability of the construction and operation of nuclear facilities in this country.
The policy of the Japanese government has been total denial. They don't even, I read early on, they don't even allow radiation early on as a diagnosis.
So as far as the secrecy goes, it's been going on, it's going to continue going on, and yes, our government is in cahoots with it.
I also am an artist first, scientist and engineer. And I question, why do I even want to continue in science or to continue to develop any tool for man to destroy themselves?
The bill is coming in for the hubris, the blindness, the greed. It's coming due, and they're not going to pay it. I have this big fear if we're successful and we get them to shut it down, they're going to wipe their hands and walk away and leave us with the problem. And there are a lot of problems in those spent fuel pools. This is why the mobilizing of people is so important. It's not an accident that the newspapers are not talking about this. They're part of the same scam. So everybody here, we have to transform our presence in the world. We have to understand that we are the ones that are going to live with this and have to deal with it.
I'm sitting here listening to this ongoing ticking up here of the Geiger counter. What would you recommend as a personal, plan of action or emergency kit or all the above?
What we're getting here is a reading of nucleuses that are disintegrating in the empty space. It's not empty, it's active. And these disintegrations, if they happen internally, they can destroy DNA. They can cause cancerous damage. There's also heart problems. Immune systems are damaged. But that's the low end of the spectrum. The liquidators that went into Chernobyl, they were vomiting their inner organs.
There's alpha radiation, there is beta radiation, and there's gamma radiation. Gamma radiation is what causes radiation sickness. And there's not enough gamma radiation coming from any particular source at Fukushima that's causing people to have radiation sickness anywhere here in this country anyway. You'd have to be exposed to it, close to it, and again, it's the same thing as X-rays. And it's the perfect industrial pollutant. Perfect industrial pollutant. It's like what someone would drool over if they wanted to hurt people but not ever have to worry about being held accountable, because when your body responds to the radioactive contamination, it takes a certain period of time for those cells that have been damaged to mutate to become cancer, and then at that point there's no little flag that comes up and says, I got that cell says I got that damage from that particular cesium isotope or that strontium isotope that I ingested into my body. That's the world that we're living in. We're reversing basically the history of evolution, when at one time this planet had so much radiation in it that no life could live on it. And now we're beginning to pour back into the environment a whole bunch of radioactive potential contaminants that can cause harm, work their way up the food chain, eventually become part of your living tissue. The best protection that we got against this is to shut it down.
And so is it possible that these rods would actually reach the core of the Earth, or is that kind of like they're too small, or I don't know?
The problem, I'm not worried about the core of the Earth. The core of the Earth would melt out anything that reached it. The problem is really where it is close to the surface of the Earth and the groundwater transporting out the radioactive contaminants.
And the ocean.
Thank you.
And ultimately into the ocean.
The reason that I had to quit being an anti-nuclear activist over 30 years ago was because the amount of feelings that I feel, the anger, the sadness, is extreme, and it's appropriate. But I think the woman that talked about the book club and having support for dealing with such heavy issues like this, maybe if you had some ideas on how we can handle this kind of information and still maintain a quality of life.
It's healthy for you to express your concern, and that's an important thing. Panic shuts down clear thinking. There's a big difference, though, between panic and informed concern. And I'm seeing a lot of stuff on the Facebook right now where there are people trying to pump up the panic, which is a way of polarizing and shutting down your ability to respond. So be careful of the fear posts, the evacuate California. That could be rephrased, is there grounds to be worried, okay? So we take that on a different level. We enter it as humans who are trying to cope with a situation that's pretty big.
I live about a bike ride's distance from the ocean. And so Fukushima is always on my mind. every day when I see the ocean. It's on my mind.
There's three things you need to know as you filter information about the contamination of the ocean. You've seen the simulations of the plume coming across. Okay, those are computer generated, they're factoring in values, and they're only factoring in the initial explosions, that first week in March. Then there's the debris that's coming. A lot of that was in the water before the explosions. It's not going to be as bad as the plume. The plume, they say, is going to get here in a couple of months or later next year. That's probably true. We're going to see an uptick. But what we need to add to that is that it's been constantly fed. It's not just a cloud coming, it's a flow. And then the third thing is there was a massive amount of radioactive isotopes in the explosions, and 20% of that went west. The Japanese were lucky. 80% went east, and 70% of that went into the ocean. So there's a lot of plutonium in the ocean already. And if you look at lifespans of butterflies and fish, you can see that they're already reacting to it faster than we are. So we have three vectors there, and I think you need to know that as people talk about, oh, it's not going to get here till later.
My wife and I run an organic farm, and we have found our activism in that to provide food for our community and take care of a piece of land. But of course, even though that does take up 200% of our time all the time, we see all the things that are happening in the world. We see the wars that are happening unjustly. We see, especially in our field, we see the genetically modified issue, and we see pesticides, all the things that we're against.
I think food choices are terribly important. I mean, we can protect ourselves ultimately by the beginning choice. What is it that we're going to purchase? Purchasing organic gives you some assurance that at least there's an effort being made to keep contaminants out of the food supply. What we've got to do is we've got to contain this industry. We've got to turn it around, and we've got to begin, and it's going to take a World War II effort. It means that really we as a people are going to have to rise to the occasion and make massive changes in our lives in order to bring it about. But we got no choice. We got no choice. We got to do it. So it's not just a simple choice of what you're going to eat. It's also a choice of what you're going to allow in your environment, to operate in your environment.
As we look forward, I'm going to be counting on everyone in this room to be here to make sure that the slow-speed nuclear disaster we're having on the Columbia River just upstream from us gets the attention of everyone in this region.
The DOE and the tri-party agreement, which has to do with the DOE, the Department of Ecology, and the Oregon Department of Energy.
EPA.
EPA. They come together for big decisions, and they have to come out to the community. If we show up, it actually matters.
We are the ones that are alive when this happened, so we have a responsibility to understand it. And if I were to boil my project and the group I'm working with, we know and we care.
We have to show that we are in solidarity with the rest of the world as far as being proponents for life. If we aren't proponents for life, we are done. Now, I read Jim Hansen's book, Storms for My Grandchildren. And there's a whole chapter in it devoted to ridiculing anti-nuclear activists. And I know where he's coming from. He's a scientist who spent his time examining the impact of carbon emissions in the atmosphere, and he sees what's coming at us on this planet. And it's severe, the impact that's going to come down if we continue to take these fossil fuels out of the ground. And so he is grasping for anything that will stop that from happening. I can understand that. And how do we respond to that? Well, we respond to that by also saying that we cannot destroy the planet by relying on something else that doesn't work. That's what it comes down to. We've got to become sane again. We have been living insanity for some time. We've got to step out from under this and reinvent the world that we live in time to save ourselves and the life support systems of this planet. It's that pure and simple. It is that pure and simple.